I know we still have some people streaming in from downstairs and finding their seats here, but want to make sure for our online folks that we get things moving as quickly as possible. And hello, everybody, and happy DAC Day. Happy DAC Day. I'm definitely getting a vibe. There's a lot of enthusiasm and enthusiasts here for DAC. Maybe DAC will become a thing. Maybe it's already a thing. And that's what we're hoping to accomplish here. On behalf of the Bipartisan Policy Center and our Direct Air Capture Advisory Council, I welcome you here to DAC Day, our gathering of the direct air capture community here in Washington, D.C. to meet, to brainstorm, share ideas, and plan the future of this promising carbon removal technology pathway. And it is really, really exciting to see so many familiar faces here and so many carbon removal leaders in the room. The technology and policy brainpower gathered here is really, really inspiring for me. We've got a lot of ground to cover in the program, and I know there are valuable networking opportunities as well, which we certainly want to encourage. So due to the carbon geekiness of the BPC, we're going to be a substance-first agenda, and then we're going to unwind afterwards with the reception, so please encourage everyone to hang around and join in the fun afterwards. And for those who don't know me, I'm Sasha Mackler, and I lead the energy program at the BPC, which includes our Direct Air Capture Advisory Council, which is a diverse group of experts that's helping to shape the federal policy agenda for DAC. Last year, our council published 3 reports on the environmental, the business, and the federal policy cases for direct air capture and how to deploy it broadly across the United States. And we have continued to play an active role here at the federal level on all the issues that we'll be discussing today, sort of the federal and commercial intersection here in the U.S. And we're really excited about the conversation that we have lined up here today, focused on the emerging growth potential for direct air capture, and especially how DAC can be supercharged through strategic partnerships between the private sector and the federal government. We have a number of federal programs that have now been put in place, enabled by the infrastructure law that was just passed and that will be implemented by the Department of Energy. We have $12 billion in federal resources allocated broadly to carbon management and infrastructure over the next 5 years. This is a really tremendously powerful starting point. And really, if you take a step back, direct air capture has come an enormously long way in a shockingly short amount of time. It was really less than 10 years ago that the entire field was made up of only a handful of people, 3 companies with scientist leaders known by their first names, Klaus, David, Peter, and almost zero attention from the climate and energy policy world. Back then, I was a lonely policy analyst working on carbon capture and DAC, and I'm just thrilled to see the blossoming field with so many new entrepreneurs and emerging technology pathways, major investors coming into the space, a bipartisan, dynamic, and growing policy coalition, and real projects on the ground now. You can thank the folks from Climeworks and their project in Iceland for having some steel in the ground there, and some bigger ones being planned right now as we speak. This field is becoming both real and a really big deal. But it's only the beginning. The scale of the climate challenge, as we all know, is enormous, and the role of DAC is both exhilarating and daunting. The DOE DAC Hubs program is a case in point. $3.5 billion, that's billion with a B, available in resources that will be deployed to develop at least 4 million ton per year hubs in different parts of the country over the next 5 years. A number of other supportive programs will be rolled out as well, from carbon storage to a new DAC prize, the possibility of a major new DAC tax credit, and new markets for removals emerging from important players in the private sector and potentially the federal government. How all this is going to come together in a manner that is catalytic, as Jigger likes to say, is critical and not yet entirely clear. But we have the right people in this room to help figure out the way forward. We're going to have a series of panels today that help us dive into topics of policy design, scale, and business models, featuring the DOE officials, the industry leaders, and the policy experts that are in the middle of it all. We also have the privilege of hearing from two of our leading senators working on energy and climate issues on a bipartisan basis. Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island will help us kick off the conversation today, and Senator Cassidy from Louisiana will help us to wrap things up. Let me just give a quick shout out of thanks to the team at BPC who imagined and planned all of this, which is no small feat. And a special thanks to Danny Broberg, who I'm sure everyone here knows by now, and if you don't yet, you will soon. Before I introduce Senator Whitehouse, just a quick logistics note. In the case of emergency, there are stairwells on both sides of the stage, and note that there is a single bathroom here on this floor, but if you go down a level, you're going to have more options there. And with that, I'll move into the program. Two changes to our speaker lineup today, just for everyone to be aware of. Unfortunately, we just heard from Senator Whitehouse that he is not able to join us in person today. Sorry about that, but he didn't want to miss out on the fun, so he generously scrambled with his team to prepare a short video as an opener for us, so we'll play that, and then we'll move into the program. One of our other panelists, Whitney Herndon from Rhodium Group, just notified us today that she couldn't join us because of illness, so hope you all understand. She sends her regrets. But now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce virtually the Democratic senator from Rhode Island, a longtime climate leader and friend of BPC, Sheldon Whitehouse. I know he needs little introduction to this crowd, but let me just say, Senator Whitehouse is a leading legislator on numerous issues, including energy, environment, and infrastructure. He's a true climate policy champion who has long understood the potential for carbon removal and for direct air capture, and the need to have them in our climate policy toolkit. He's been Rhode Island's state attorney general and its U.S. attorney before being elected to the Senate in 2007, where he serves on the Finance Committee, the Judiciary Committee, the Environment and Public Works Committee, and the Budget Committee. He's very busy. Senator Whitehouse has been an important steward of carbon management policies, including the Bipartisan OCED Act, which passed in 2020, and he has been a critical advocate for everyone in this room for reforms to 45Q that would enhance financial incentives for carbon capture and especially for direct air capture. We'll turn to the senator for his opening remarks by video, and then I'll ask my colleague Zan Fishman to jump on the stage and introduce our first panel. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks for being here.
Hi, I'm Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center for convening this event and for making me a part of it. The time to act on climate is now, and we must meet Mother Nature's test of 1.5 degrees Celsius of global heating. There may be no silver bullet, but we have many options. We have silver buckshot, and we will need to pursue those multiple solutions. Beyond cutting carbon emissions, we need to remove gigatons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by 2050. Otherwise, we're shooting right past our limit of safety. Once you're past the limit of safety, adding no further emissions isn't enough. You have to claw back the excess carbon. So we need to bring carbon removal technologies online, and we need to bring them online as quickly as possible. The $3.5 billion from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law will help us get there, but additional investments now will be immensely valuable down the road. Carbon capture technologies, including direct air capture, have an important role to play in mitigating the damage we are doing to our planet. I introduced the federal CDR Leadership Act with Senator Coons because investments in these technologies are critical. Our bill would boost investment, create jobs, and help make the U.S. a global leader in the technology of carbon removal. Critically, the federal CDR Leadership Act would authorize the Department of Energy to buy captured carbon dioxide from CDR companies, giving the industry a much-needed jump start and spurring innovation. The solutions are in reach. Not silver bullets, but perhaps silver buckshot. Solutions nonetheless. Let's get them going and let's solve this problem.
All right, come on up, Noah, Brad. Happy DAC Day, everybody. I'm so excited. It's DAC Day. I haven't been this excited since, you know, like you're younger and it's December and you wake up in the morning and you're like, oh, today's gonna be great, and you turn over and you look at your phone and you're like, December 1st, Carbon Day. You're like, this is better. We've got a bunch of DAC nerds in the room here, maybe not nerdier than me. But I'm so glad that everyone's here, because this technology has so much potential, so much opportunity, but it's also, you know, a bit hard to see how we get from where we are now to where we want to be in the future. Gigatons. And so I'm glad you're here. We've got 3 panels. The first panel, we're going to talk a little bit about DAC, building this industry of the future, where we're going, where we are now, what are the opportunities. The next panel is going to be focused on hubs, the really interesting challenges and designing the hubs. What are the options? What are the decision points? How are they going to help? How are they useful? How are they going to advance DAC? And then the third panel is about financing DAC, revenue streams, long-term business case. We've got an all-star lineup. I cannot wait for you guys to hear from all of these experts. And I can't wait to ask my panel, who I'm about to introduce, the questions that I've got prepared. Because, as Senator Whitehouse said, it's time to act on climate. And this is a climate solution. So, without further ado, first up, from FECM, we've got Noah Deitch, Acting Director for Carbon Removal and CO2 Conversion at the DOE Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. Noah is the Acting Director for Carbon Removal and CO2 Conversion. Prior to that, Noah co-founded Carbon 180, a nonprofit focused on carbon dioxide removal. Previously, Noah served on the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board, as well as the Biden-Harris Transition Energy Agency Review Team. Prior to founding Carbon 180, Noah was a management consultant focused on environmental market and carbon offset modeling, renewable and fossil energy power plant valuations, energy efficiency and demand response program design, and corporate social responsibility strategy assessments. Noah received his MBA from the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley and his BA from the University of Virginia. Our second panelist, Brad Markell, Executive Director of the Industrial Union Council, AFL-CIO. He also chairs the AFL-CIO Energy Task Force. The IUC is comprised of 11 unions with over 2 million members, including nearly 1 million directly employed in the manufacturing sector. Prior to joining the staff of the AFL-CIO, Brad was an international representative with the UAW in Detroit for 15 years, where his duties included helping develop and advance the union's positions on energy and environmental policy, and performing costing and financial analysis for bargaining. Brad has degrees from the University of Michigan and Wayne State University. He joined the UAW in 1976 and is a member of Local 14 in Toledo, Ohio. And unfortunately, we were supposed to have a third panelist, Whitney Herndon from Rhodium Group. She's not able to join us. Her voice will be missed, but we get, you know, a 6th more time with each of these guys. So here we go. Noah. FECM. Got a name change. All of a sudden, that's CM. That's new. It used to be fossil energy. Now we got carbon management. Like, what's the deal with that? How did that happen? Why was that name change? And where does DAC fit into all that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And let me just say congrats again for this wonderful event. Sasha is not being hyperbolic that he was the only one talking carbon removal policy when I first met him, and to see this room here today is just a wonderful testament to the field and the work that y'all do at BPC. So thank you and congrats for this. I think the fossil energy and carbon management name change, it means a lot and was very intentional for our office. We see carbon management in particular playing a critical role in meeting our climate goals, as well as the administration's other priorities when it comes to jobs, economy, and building an equitable and environmentally responsible industry of the future. The office has a long history of working on carbon management, in fact. We've been doing carbon management research and development from technologies to capture carbon, geologic sequestration for 2 decades. Recognizing that in the name really helps position where we want to go as an industry. And I think another amazing change in that organization is we now have a division for carbon removal. That in and of itself would have been a very crazy idea when Sasha and I first met almost a decade ago. But now this is an increasingly prominent part of our work, with tens of millions of dollars for research and development funded every year, and now billions of dollars to spend in our infrastructure bill. So it's just a very exciting time, and the direction is one that we're very proud of.
Thanks. And I just wanted to add in, I'd love for this to be a conversation. If the two of you want to pick up on either of those points, riff, build upon, improve, spin, whatever you want to do, feel free. So,
well,
Brad.
I do have to give Brad partial credit for that, because when we were on the transition team, it's really part of the vision that labor has seen this for decades at this point, the potential of these technologies. And yeah.
We love the DOE and all its growth, all of its changes, and really this is a big piece of where labor sees the climate solution going, is carbon management.
Great. So Brad, you've been representing workers for quite a while. When we think about this industry, it's tempting to think about stuff, machines, technology, but people are going to be building that stuff, and those people have skills, and they have families, and they've got lives. Like, what does this particular climate solution mean for workers?
I really want to start with what Senator Whitehouse said about the timing we have and post-2040, post-2050, and the vision that we have to meet our climate goals. And then realize, thank you for not really putting a number on that, but for a while, having done this, in the auto industry, watching the rise of electric vehicles. And what I take away from these kind of life lessons are, we have a goal that's very important. We have an industry that needs to be built, and it's going to take a couple decades to get where we need to go in terms of the volumes, in terms of the production facilities, the materials. When NOAA's office develops that silver bullet, that one that says, hey, we're going to do this. We're going to do this at, $70 a ton, $80 a ton. And then there's a long period we have to build out our production capacity. I think one of the best things about the bipartisan infrastructure laws, it really contemplates the manufacturing side of this. We got to build these machines. Got to figure out, hey, where's the steel coming from? What kind of, rare materials do we need? What kind of new materials do we need? And that all adds up over a period of a couple decades into building a significant industry that's not only going to employ construction workers, but it's going to employ factory workers, it's going to employ transport workers. And the job numbers are not going to be super big in the next, pick a number, 5-10 years. But they are going to be significant if we're going to meet our climate goals. I think the last thing I would say, and this is where our love of DOE and its technology complex that it has, this is an industry that America can lead in, that we really can hopefully export. We don't do a lot of exporting in the United States, but our technology advantage, if we combine that with a deployment advantage and the learning that comes from that, this really can be an industry where we're going to be a global leader.
Awesome. So, Noah, DAC, direct air capture. A lot of people confuse that with traditional carbon capture. Can you just draw the distinction between the two? Like, what's similar, but what's the distinction, just so we're starting this day off with no confusion as to what we're talking about between those two?
Yeah, sure. So when we think about direct air capture, we are, differently from point source capture, not associated with a direct industrial facility or power plant. We can put the capture of CO2 wherever there is good storage and good resources to do that direct air capture. This is a really key distinction because it enables us a lot more geographic flexibility in exactly where projects go, and it has big implications for workforce. We're not tied to exactly where we make the emissions to clean them up. We break that geographic interconnection, and we can really do this anywhere. The technologies look similar in some dimensions, but when we think about capturing carbon from the air, it is simply way more challenging technically and requires a different type of energy than doing it from a concentrated industrial facility. And so many people are completely re-envisioning what carbon capture means when they think about direct air capture. And it's fascinating to see it on the technical dimensions as well as the social and geographic ones.
I want to pick up on that because Noah's raising a very important point. A big part of my job has been to work on what we call just transition. And the key to just transition is not training. Anybody who comes with a training program as just transition is going to get laughed at in the labor movement because training doesn't create jobs. It's investment that creates jobs. And we face this terrible problem of a spatial mismatch between where jobs are declining, say in coal country, or other places that are disinvested, EJ communities. We can put these DAC hubs or machines, centers, in places that really need jobs. And you know, from a labor point of view, from what the administration has said, you know, the reordering of our economy to solve climate change is also an opportunity to reorder the fairness of our economy, where our economy has been growing, and to push jobs to places that really need jobs. It's a big deal.
And I'll add, Brad, it's the types of jobs that matter too. When we think about direct air capture, many of the jobs that we are creating will feel very similar to folks who are currently working in the oil and gas or the broader fossil fuel industry. And this is an opportunity for them to be able to use a similar skill set in a way that's more aligned with our climate goals as well as economic ones. And so we're optimistic that this will be a pathway that can appeal to more folks who are currently in that industry and do want to transition.
So what does that mean? What kinds of jobs are these? Like, there's a diverse set of things that we have to make: facilities and storage sites. There's utilization. There's power issues. Like, what are these jobs? Who are these people we're talking about?
Yeah, you nailed it, right? So that's the real breadth of different jobs here. There are similar jobs that look like petroleum engineering. What we are trying to do in storing carbon is, instead of finding wells and pulling oil or fluid out, is to find wells that we can put CO2 in. And it's a similar set of technical skills on the engineering side of that. And then it's not just the heavy construction jobs, but just big industrial operations. And so many of the unions in Brad's network have big equities in a big DAC future.
These are the kind of jobs, that you know, take a lot of training that labor excels in, but also that have traditionally, you know, been family supporting, high wage jobs with benefits, you know, and this the kind of value added that is in the supply chain when you think about this, you know, the steel, copper, all the materials, all the precision construction, those typically are very well-paid jobs.
And I think the supply chain point is a great one. We have an opportunity to make sure through policy change that supply chain stays here. And we've seen that not happen with other types of clean energy. We are at such an early stage in the DAC industry today versus the DAC technology itself that we have an opportunity to make that industry happen here. And if we can make sure that those jobs stay here, that those economics stay here. And I'm optimistic that we'll be able to influence that, not just today, but into the future as well.
We're not trying to run the clock out here. Noah and I had a little practice during the transition.
This is good.
But I got to say, like, when I look at like the diagrams of what the machines look like, I see pressure vessels. I see pipes that are the highest value added product in the steel sector. I see a lot of steel. I see a lot of precision machining, pumps and things like that really are high quality jobs, high skilled and high paying.
Terrific. this is like the easiest moderating job I've ever had. You guys ask your own questions, answer your own questions. Like you really don't need me, and I'm fine with that. This is good. So I really appreciated the fact that you kind of honed in on like who these people are, and it's not kind of theoretical, like building specific types of components of the infrastructure we need. Like these are jobs for people, they support families. I do want to back up just a step though, because when we're thinking about direct air capture, that's removal. And there's some people out there who are saying focusing on carbon dioxide removal is a waste of time, it's a distraction. We should put all of our focus 100% on reducing emissions and not focus on removal. Could you just explain a little bit about why that's flawed reasoning? Not that reducing emissions isn't important, it's incredibly important. But that it's like a both, not or?
Yeah, so I think it actually, maybe stepping back to answer your earlier question about what actually is direct air capture. Direct air capture doesn't necessarily need to be carbon removal. Carbon removal is an outcome. We can get it many different ways. Direct air capture is a technology. We can use it to pull the CO2 out of the air and then put it in the ground. We can turn it into a fuel that we use to displace a fossil alternative. There are lots of different things that we can do. So I don't want to make it seem as if all direct air capture is inherently carbon removal, because I think that's an important distinction. It's how we use the technology that matters, not what the technology is. But at the end of the day, what we see as critical is figuring out how to get to really bold and ambitious climate goals fast. And in order to do that, it simply helps to have all of the options on the table that we can. This administration has said that they want to get to a net zero power sector by 2035 and an economy by 2050. I cannot overstate how ambitious that is. And we see it just being really critical to have more technology options on the table than less. And those technology options are not just for engineering so that we can achieve a technical goal better, but because each community is going to want different sets of solutions in order to participate in those goals. And we need to make sure that we are offering solutions that can meet all of the communities, and we're really providing all of those options. And so that's how we think about that.
Great.
Look, when Senator Whitehouse is out saying this is a thing, I think a lot of climate hawks can take comfort in that. For me, it's just, this is math. If you read the IPCC report, and don't want to cherry pick the IPCC report, then it's pretty clear that in the second half of the century, we need to do massive amounts of carbon removal. We've already polluted too much, right? Carbon removal is the only thing that gets to the past pollution. Everything else is about the future pollution. And so for us, when we look at what it's going to take in 50 years, in 70 years, if we don't do direct air capture, if we don't do carbon removal, we're not going to hit our climate goals. And it's just that simple.
Right. So I've heard some people say that, this decade, the next decade, we should focus on reducing emissions. And then, in the decade after that, we should turn to removal. You know what it's like to scale up an industry from a nascent stage to full commercialization. Can we go from where we are now to gigatons in the course of a decade, or do we need to start sooner?
Well, we need to start as soon as possible because there are sure to be some bumps in the road. There are sure to be some issues with the market. Not to put too fine a point on it, possibly some permitting issues. And there's just like the climate risk is so high that in my auto worker voice, I'll say we need to put the pedal to the metal now because not everything is going to come out exactly the way we want, right? And the risk of failure in people terms and what it means for communities, for workers that have to work in the heat, for our infrastructure needs, for our resilience needs, for the amount of money we may or may not spend on adaptation. All these things add up to the idea that we have to use the silver buckshot and leave no stone unturned. The risk is just too high. And it takes years. Look, just EVs have been around for a long time. 20 years really since the first ones came into the market, right? We're just now getting to volume.
We like to say the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. We can't end up 20 years into the future needing this stuff at gigaton scale and say, oh, let's get started. It's just, it'll be 20 years too late, and we don't have that time to lose anymore.
Right. So why can't we get to gigaton scale in a year? Like, what do we need to do to get from here to there?
So there's a lot of pieces of this. At the end of the day, it's just building stuff. We need to figure out the customer demand for that. We need to figure out the financing of it. We need to figure out the engineering. And we need to figure out how to do this in a way that lifts up communities where these projects are happening and really empowers them to decide where they go and to benefit from the opportunities that they create.
Great. So Brad, you've mentioned both permitting and siting as being, really, really important challenges, but also opportunities, and particularly in the siting. How do you think about that in terms of what policymakers should be focusing on right now in deploying these stuff?
Incentives of all sorts are important. And, I do a lot of trade work, a lot of international work. And when we see what other countries around the world have done, when we see what China has done with some very deliberate policies, there's a lot of consternation around China, trade policies, trade fairness, and all that. But the flip side of the coin is that the Chinese have actually gotten pretty darn good at industrial policy, right? Now, we're not going to, do it the way the Chinese have done it. But from the labor movement, in my union, the UAW, we've been calling for industrial policy for like 40 years, right? And we've got this moment now where people seem to realize that we can't hit our goals, as Noah said, without being deliberate, without being intentional about it, about really understanding where we're trying to land. And so with industries that are in these early stages, it's really important that we're providing public funding in ways that help private industry bridge the gap and then get to that financing question so that something becomes financeable on the basis of its own economics. And that really is, for all the climate solutions, that's the goal. It's got to get to a place where the market just takes over and this becomes a thing that is attractive to market players.
And this is just particularly hard to wrap your head around in the scale that we have to go. So a recent IEA report on direct air capture noted that if we build all of the direct air capture currently in the pipeline, it will represent something like a 4,000% increase in direct air capture compared to today. So wild growth. At the same time, if we only build that capacity, we will have built less than 5% of the capacity we need to in order to be anywhere close to our cost reduction trajectories. So on the one hand, massive growth. On the other hand, we need to keep going at that same pace. And to have policy to recognize that, I think it's not how we traditionally think about this. And it's a big challenge, but one that we have to rise to if we're going to get this field to where it needs to be in time to meet our climate goals.
So let's talk about policy for a second. We have this bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is terrific. It's got $3.5 billion for hubs. It's got other funding for the SIFIA, the SCALE Act. We got sequestration. We got the DAC prize. We got CDR, RD&D funding, and there's a lot there. But there's probably more needed. Can you talk about kind of where we are in terms of policy and what we should be thinking about next?
Yeah, happy to. I think what we're actually seeing from the private sector is a great model today for where the public sector can follow and scale shortly thereafter. We're going to hear from folks at Frontier later about how they're thinking about being an advanced market commitment and pulling a demand for carbon removal holistically, not just direct air capture, but any pathway that can get us to that carbon removal goal in an economic way. And at the end of the day, we're going to need scale. And so all of the policy tools that can help us not just put billions of dollars into the field, but ultimately hundreds of billions of dollars a year, that's where we're going to need to go in order to meet these goals. And figuring out how we do that, plenty of options on the table. We just need to set our sights at that appropriate level of ambition.
I think of it as, first of all, there's a very important interplay between doing and learning, right? And the most important advances are not going to come in the lab. No offense to anybody who's in the lab, but they come when you're in the field, when you're developing things, when you're using them, finding out how to make it cheaper, how to make it with less material, all these things that we see in manufacturing all the time. Then we'll get to a place where carbon removal is in a spot like a lot of clean energy technologies are, where it's not about the hubs, it's not about the research necessarily that has to still carry on. The DOE, for example, is still doing a lot of research in wind and solar, even though they're becoming market competitive. Well, we're going to get to a place where we're going to say, hey, now tax credits for people that are ready to deploy are the thing. And we'll get, from the kind of like technology growth stage, technology maturation stage, to a stage where the government should provide the kind of incentives that will help private investors really put their business case over the top.
So what are those incentives? Right now, Congress is debating a reconciliation package that could include clean energy tax credits. 45Q is a component of that. Direct pay, several enhancements to make 45Q easier to access. Where do you see the need for that for DAC, and why is that enhanced 45Q so important?
First of all, just to be clear for everybody, the labor movement is an extreme supporter of 45Q and all the enhancements around 45Q. We think it should be clean. We think that 45Q ought to have the same kind of status, even in areas such as, like with hydrogen, right? We want to stack the 45Q with the hydrogen tax credit. We think it's kind of silly that that's not happening, and it's really sort of, at least our view, ideological. And I'm kind of walling Noah off from some of these comments. But it is really important that we use the right set of tools for each technology. And 45Q is going to be a boon to carbon capture, to carbon removal, to building out the pipelines we need. And Noah mentioned carbon conversion. As technology advances, I don't want us to sleep on carbon conversion, because as we look at the use of liquid fuels, for example, and cleaner liquid fuels, with hydrogen and carbon conversion, there are pathways to cleaner fuels that we're going to be needing for several decades. And I do think that some of the first offtake actually could be in conversion.
All right. So, unfortunately, I'm at the end of my not the end of my questions, but at the end of my time for questions. Though I would love to keep asking you questions for another couple hours, but we do have a few minutes for some audience questions. We've got some mics floating around the room. If we want to get a couple questions from the audience, we've got 10-ish minutes, and then we'll move into the next panel.
Yeah, I'm John with Greenpeace. Reading the DAC Hubs announcement by DOE, in the notice of intent, it says that companies that want to use captured carbon for enhanced oil recovery to the effect need not apply. No, I was wondering if you could kind of walk out the DOE's reasoning for that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it. I can't talk about the funding opportunity itself beyond what's public already. But what I will say is that we are listening to where industry is going on many of these different solutions. And what we're hearing is people are looking for DAC because it is a climate solution. And they are looking to maximize that climate benefit for that. And in order to do that, you need to have a dedicated storage system. And so it's important for us to make sure that we are facilitating companies who want to do that to find geologic storage options that they can use that are going to have that real climate impact. I don't think any of us would be here, and we wouldn't be talking about direct air capture if it weren't for that climate benefit. And so it's making sure that we're staying aligned with where the real frontier of the field is going.
I'm Bob Van Heuveln with the Vogel Group. There's a perception abroad that the administration will not support use of carbon capture from carbon-emitting facilities, specifically fossil fuel plants and that sort. It seems to me that's counterproductive to sort of the overall atmospheric condition. Can you clarify where people stand on that?
Yeah, so the Congress was very clear in a lot of the infrastructure funding about what types of carbon capture projects we would support. As part of the carbon capture demonstrations, for example, there are carbon capture projects required on coal generation facilities, natural gas generation facilities, and heavy industry that are going to involve fossil fuel, right? So we have an intent to deliver on those to the extent that Congress has said so, and we see a real opportunity to use those to learn and position the industry for the future.
There was a lot of attention from labor about making sure that the diversity of the deployment was out there geographically in terms of different kinds of projects. And so if you look through the bill, if you look at the hydrogen, for example, same thing, couple of these, couple of those, really trying to understand how each technology pathway is going to play out, and then, how is that going to push us into the future for the next round of investments.
More audience questions? We've got one in the back over there, I see.
How long do you have to do this, DAC? Because I have a feeling that before we go too long, the Jurassic Park scenario might show up. So how long do you have to do it, and do you have a plan to use the carbon dioxide that you're going to capture?
I think the question is, what's the timeline? How fast do we really need to get this up and running, and what might we do with the CO2 that we capture?
So from where I sit, it's as fast as we can go responsibly. We do have time. The science doesn't look like there's going to be some Jurassic Park scenario, as you mentioned, imminently. But we have to get started on this with pace. The infrastructure bill gives us the money that we need to do over the next 5 years to support a really ambitious scale-up of the industry. When we're talking about 1,000-ton per year demonstrations, which is the state of the field today, going to million-ton per year scale in the not-too-distant future, that is a massive engineering challenge in and of itself. And we don't want to downplay how ambitious that is, and that this is the exact type of policy ambition that we need to figure out how to pull the industry to that scale. Because ultimately, million-ton scale is that sort of base unit if we're ever going to get to the billions of tons that we're going to need to be sequestering annually to meet our climate goals.
Hey, I thought I'd jump in here. Thanks. This is a great conversation. I know you can't dive into the details of the hub program because the NOI is out, but maybe if you could just share a bit of thinking around, in your view, at DOE, DOE's view, what's success look like to you, and what are the problems and the challenges and the questions you're thinking about today that you could use help with, or that are really sort of critical path type questions to get to that endpoint that you see the hubs sort of providing to sort of launch this industry? Can you just say a little bit about kind of what's going through your head there?
Yeah, happy to. And what we really want to do is hear from the field. Where are communities that really want direct air capture hubs? Where are technology providers in developing hub concepts? Understanding what the state of the industry is and where we can put projects that are going to have the greatest, not just technical benefits, but also social and economic ones are critical for us. So understanding where folks are in their development of this, we recognize that this is happening very quickly. If we had said even 2 years ago, where is your plan for a million-ton per year DAC hub, we probably would have gotten crazy looks, like who would ever be planning that, because where would it come from? And yet here we are today. And so I think that's a great opportunity, and we want to hear from the community so that we're making sure that we're leveraging our dollars to the greatest extent that we can.
from labor's point of view, we want to see some outcomes around cost, around, hey, are we going to run into any technical roadblocks? Are there sort of materials roadblocks out there that we need to be conscious of? What happens when you start running larger plants over a longer period of time? Are there operational and maintenance issues? How do the skills that our members bring to the table play into solving those problems? And so, when these hubs are up and running and we get some data from them, that's going to be a really, really important inflection point for us to take a look at how this is all playing out.
All right. I think we're going to wrap up this panel here. Thank you so much. It's clear from what you've said that DAC has it's an amazing opportunity. You can see its future. But right now, it's like in its infancy. It's like, just starting to walk and, might fall down a little bit, might want to pick it back up again. We've got these hub programs where we're investing in its future, in its education. And I think that, as we're working together with the whole stakeholder community, DOE, industry, the think tank community, we're all just really focused on what success looks like, what our roles are, and how best to advance the field so that we actually achieve these climate goals. So thank you so much for your expertise, for your answers. This is the easiest moderating job I've had since you guys basically moderated yourself. And I'm going to pass it over to Danny Broberg, who is going to bring up the next panel to talk more about hub design. Thank you so much.
Panel to come on up. Before we get started with this next panel, there's kind of a lot of people over here and less people over here. I'm going to ask for a little do-si-do shuffle movement here. I think what we're going to do is try to have people over here shift this way, and if you're here, try to shift this way if there's room. Just because it's a little easier. There's more people over here. And maybe people sitting in the back, please feel free to shuffle in. Sorry for the inconvenience. Thank you.
Do we have assigned seats here?
Whatever seat feels right to you. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Okay, great.
Sure. Pause are a good way to do that.
Live mics.
Good. Good.
I don't know if I don't think my phone.
I think y'all's will be, or I'm clearly live. Right. All right. Okay. Still getting a few people seated. See some friends in the back moseying in. There we go. Excellent. All right. Panel 2 of DAC Day. Thanks so much for sticking around, y'all. My name is Danny Broberg. I am a senior policy analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and just tremendously excited about this panel we have for you today. In some ways, when we first thought about DAC Day, this panel is very much representative of what we were looking for and sort of teasing out the specifics of the DAC Hubs program itself. So this last panel we had is very much more about sort of the vision for a new industry and sort of the opportunities that direct air capture presents for the US economy. This panel is going to focus in on the DAC Hubs program itself. We've said it a couple times, but I think we all need to reflect for a second on how big of a deal the bipartisan infrastructure bill was, passed in November. This is $3.5 billion to build out 4 regional DAC hubs. And there were a couple of specific statutory requirements from that bill. We know that these hubs have to capture and sequester at least 1 million tons annually. That's probably not going to happen next year, but at some point in the future, that's the vision for these hubs. There's a couple of other things in statute, prioritizing regions with existing fossil fuel production and regions that have the greatest potential for job creation. So there are things like this that help guide how these hubs will be deployed, but there's a lot of open questions as well. And that's what we're going to dive into a little bit here today. Some of these questions that we're hoping to talk about are the need to balance million-ton per year removal with innovation. We need both of these things. We need to chew gum and walk and chew gum, as they would say, because scale in the short term is the purpose for these hubs, but innovation helps drive down costs in the long term as well, and it will ensure that we can reach the scale we need. So making sure that these hubs are set up to do both is a tricky problem. We're hoping to get into that with our panels here today. A couple other questions we'd like to dive into. The chicken and egg problem is something we discuss a lot in this community, where you simultaneously need to capture, transport, and store CO2 at the same time in order to do any individual part of it. And if you can only capture, then you need to put that CO2 somewhere, and you get the picture. So figuring out how to do these hubs where you're scaling up everything at the same time, it's kind of like building an airplane while you're flying it. We'll dive into that a little bit. And then, another question we'd like to talk about is what it actually means to do meaningful local community engagement that goes beyond just a single conversation. Makes communities that have been disenfranchised actually a part of the hub deployment process. And again, not an easy problem, but something that we're hoping to talk a little bit about today. So I have an excellent panel up here. I'm going to introduce them in a second. I could probably spend the rest of the panel introducing them because their background is really impressive, but I do want to get to the moderated discussion. Like the last panel, this will be 25 to 30 minutes of discussion with 10 minutes of Q&A at the end, so get your questions ready. Let's get to it. I'll introduce them and then we'll start off with some initial questions. So first off, we have Kelly Cummins, who is the Acting Director and Principal Deputy Director for the DOE Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. She has over 20 years of experience working in national energy security issues at DOE. Prior to running OCED, she was the Associate Deputy Director for Field Operations at DOE's Office of Science, where she was responsible for management and oversight of the Office of Science Field Complex, which I believe includes the 10 national labs. And also has a storied past of working at NNSA and in various other very impressive positions at DOE, including as a senior advisor to Secretary Arnie Moniz from 2013 to 2017. She also has a Master's of Science in Georgia Institute of Technology. As I was doing my research for how to introduce these people, I realized this is an entire panel of scientists, and we are sort of examples of alternate career paths if you decide to study science, I think. I don't know if everyone realized this, but 3 out of 4 out of us are ex-congressional fellows, and it's great just having science representation on stage. I love it. Next up, we have Suchi Talati, going out of order here a little bit, but that's okay, who is currently a senior visiting scholar at Carbon 180, recently departed Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, where she was the chief of staff since the beginning of the Biden administration, left a few months ago and has been serving at Carbon 180 for the last couple months. Prior to working at DOE, she was deputy director of policy at Carbon 180. She was, I believe, simultaneously a scholar in residence at American University and also worked at the Union of Concerned Scientists, all on carbon removal as well as solar geoengineering policies as well. She was a Congressional Science Fellow, as I mentioned, in the US Senate. She also did a stint at White House OSTP. Before that, got her PhD in engineering and public policy at the Carnegie Mellon University. And finally, we have Marcus Extebor, who is the Chief Scientist and Vice President of Energy and Climate at XPRIZE. He leads the development and execution of the Foundation's portfolio of energy and climate change innovation programs, including the $100 million XPRIZE carbon removal competition, which is funded by Elon Musk, as well as the NRG COSIA Carbon XPRIZE. He's a member of the US National Academy of Science Board on energy and environmental systems, has extensive experience in the private sector working on electricity markets, and was also a former US Senate Congressional Fellow. He has a PhD in quantum optics, so if anyone has any questions about molecular quantum optics or density functional theory, please get those ready.
DFT, I can't believe you went there.
Well, excellent. Without further ado, I'd love to jump into some opening questions to get us started. Kelly, I'm going to start with you. You are the acting director for the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. This is a brand new office at DOE. It's focused on scaling up traditional demonstration projects to the next level. The bipartisan infrastructure bill created the OCED and also tasked it with a long list of responsibilities, which we can go more into. I think it's over $20 billion in authority. This includes the large-scale pilots and demos for CCUS, the regional hydrogen hubs, a new advanced nuclear reactor demonstration program, and much more. Some people in this room are super engaged with you and your team talking about OCED, but there are other people in the room who might be less familiar with OCED. I would like to ask you, help us understand the mission of the OCED, and how does it fit into the execution of the DAC hubs themselves?
Sure, thank you for that question. And yes, it is a wide range of technologies that we're dealing with in the new Office of Clean Energy demonstrations, but very excited to be working with our colleagues in fossil energy and carbon management on the DAC hubs. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Office of Clean Energy demonstrations, it was authorized in the infrastructure law. It was established by the department in December, and I have been on board since January. There was about 2 people on board for the first month or so, but I'm pleased to announce that we are now finally staffing up and getting ready to implement this historic scope of work that we have. So the overall mission of the office is to deliver clean energy and decarbonization demonstration projects at scale in partnership with industry so that we can accelerate their market adoption and deployment. And all of this is part of our equitable transition to a decarbonized economy. I think the International Energy Agency recently said that we need to have about $90 billion in demonstration projects over the next decade for us to meet our 2050 net zero goals. And I'm really pleased that we have this historic amount of money for large-scale demonstrations through the infrastructure law. I think the total is more than $25 billion that was provided to DOE specifically for demonstration projects. More than $20 billion was appropriated to this new Office of Clean Energy demonstrations. But there were also other appropriations, like, for instance, the DAC hubs to the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. But regardless of where the appropriations lie, I think the department as a whole realized that we needed to provide more consistency and rigor to our large-scale demonstration projects. I think it's no surprise to folks in this room that the department has had a mixed bag of success when it comes to these demonstration projects. So what we're really trying to do in the Office of Clean Energy demonstrations is create a center of excellence for oversight, project management oversight in particular, of these large-scale demonstration projects. We've been going back through all of the lessons learned of prior demonstration projects and trying to make sure that we learn from those projects and create processes and procedures that keep us from repeating missteps of the past. If I can give one example, one of the things that we found is that for these large projects, we didn't spend enough time doing some of the front-end planning. So we're really trying to be thoughtful about a phased approach to these projects such that we have enough time to make sure that the detailed designs are in place, that the siting, the permitting, the NEPA process has a plan, that we're engaging communities, and we're building that into the policies and procedures that we're working on right now. What we're really trying to do is for those projects that were appropriated to us, as well as those projects that are in other offices, that we have this set of procedures, this set of skills, these opportunities to provide that enhanced oversight for all demonstration projects at the department. And that's what we're really focused on and have been working extremely closely with the Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Program on the DAC hubs in particular, hoping that we can bring some of the expertise that we're building right now to bear to make sure that these projects are successful. And I really do see this as a life cycle of cooperation between this new office and FECM, as well as the Loan Programs Office and others that we're working with very closely.
Excellent. Well, a lot to unpack from what you just said. I'd love to dive more into in questions in a second. But for now, let's shift to Marcus. Loosely put, the goal of the X Prize is to leverage the power of competition to catalyze innovation and accelerate a more hopeful future for the benefit of humanity. took that from the website. Did it sound like it? Well, in April of this year, you awarded 15 $1 million grants to carbon removal companies, some of whom are actually in this room right now. And this is part of your $100 million prize for carbon removal. Help us understand why X Prize chose to create a prize focused on carbon removal, and where do you see DAC Hubs fitting into that whole picture right now?
Yeah, certainly. Well, thanks for the question, and let me just take the opportunity to say thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. So why are we using a prize? What are we hoping to achieve, and sort of what's the point of all of this? I would say we're trying to solve a couple of big problems. One, we're here to talk about carbon removal. Carbon removal barely exists. We have a tiny capacity, installed capacity today of, let's call it anthropogenic or human-driven carbon removal, and we're talking about trying to increase that capacity from approximately 0 to, let's say, 1 billion or more over the next couple of decades. So one of the things we thought a prize could really help with is increase the number of viable solutions that could be then evaluated for further deployment, scale-up, and development. If we are, in a race to get to this huge target, we just need to increase sort of the start of the funnel. So it's one of the big goals of the prize, is just get more people doing more quality carbon removal. Structurally, the prize is a competition. It's basically a bounty system. We've raised $100 million. Thank you, Musk Foundation. We're going to give that money away to people that can demonstrate credible, reliable, actual functioning carbon removal, even at a modest sort of pilot plant scale. Think of, for DAC, something probably approximately the size of a shipping container. If you can generate one of those at a minimum scale, and we know some folks in the room have already done that, there's a bounty for you. We awarded $15 million recently, 5 before that to a group of students. And then we have another 80 on hand to see sort of fully operational CDR solutions within the next couple of years, 3 years specifically. Just to finish answering your question, we launched the prize wanting to accelerate the number of solutions, specifically increase the attention and focus of younger people on the topic. This is a long-term thing. That means it's people that are actually children or in their teens that are going to carry this forward after some time. So we wanted to figure out a way to engage youth. We wanted to focus on the scientific and engineering rigor of validation of solutions. To be blunt, there's a lot of talk about carbon removal, and it's great talk and it's great conversation, but we want to push some of these demos into, some of these ideas into demonstrations so that they can be evaluated in the field. And the last thing we wanted to do is try as we can, and this is connected to hubs, to accelerate equitable scaling. I think the prize can be thought of as a feeder system of technologies into what eventually will be DAC hubs. Once these things are set up, they're going to need technologies. Everyone's going to try to figure out which ones to play in. Hopefully the prize can increase the number of viable technology options that could be part of a hub.
Excellent. All right, turning to you now, Suchi. The DAC Hubs were just one program in the infrastructure bill. It's a big program, granted, but there are a number of other programs that are very related and could enable success at the hubs. We've got the DAC Technology Prize competition. We've got increased funding for geologic storage. We've got a revamped carbon removal RD&D program. We've got the CFIA loan program for CO2 pipelines. We've got industrial demos. From Carbon 180's perspective, how should these various programs complement each other? Where are there synergies that make sense with the DAC hubs? How would you approach that kind of problem with different complementary programs?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Just to echo Marcus, thanks again for having me at this really wonderful event. To answer your question, there really is no carbon removal unless all of these programs work together. The DAC hubs represent a certain kind of technology, as Noah mentioned, but without storage, without a utilization program, without viable transport options, we can't have a successful hub. And so these things will have to be intertwined deeply, and I think that's why one of the reasons the infrastructure package included the Office of Clean Energy demonstrations is so we can have a really core team thinking through how these things have to integrate. I think really importantly too, it's not just those programs. It's about low carbon and zero carbon energy to power DAC. It's about making sure that we are co-locating a lot of these things so that we're minimizing burdens on the communities that we're building the infrastructure in. And I think we also really need to think about how we're setting up CDR for success by these initial programs. And I think it's really hard to think about because this was a lot of money. It was, I hope not a once in a generation bill, but, a very, landmark piece of legislation. And we have to think about how these programs are going to set up CDR for success in the future. And so not everything is ready for demonstration. And so we really need to make sure that we're continuing to fund key R&D programs like the DAC Prize might fund, like regular appropriations continue to fund, that might help a hub succeed in 10 to 15 years. And I think as we start funding more and more programs, it's ensuring that there's very clear integration and clear cooperation for us to be able to fund programs that can work together, not just now, but to meet our 2050 goals, to meet our goals to reduce legacy emissions after we hit net zero. And that's just really critical.
Excellent. Well, I want to run this panel kind of like Zan Fishman did. If there's a moment where anyone else wants to jump in, these questions are not just intended for each of you, but along that vein, being thoughtful about how we make this happen. Kelly, you had mentioned earlier, thoughtful front end, making sure you get it right on the front end. Let's talk for a second about risk, because it's real. I know you've done a lot of risk management through various roles, previously at DOE. Now you're at OCED, evaluating potentially a different kind of risk. And I guess previewing the next panel after this is going to feature Jigar Shah, and part of that is going to be about risk that the Loan Program Office has to think about. But OCED kind of has a different kind of risk they need to think about. There's sort of this interesting dynamic where the hubs can support both commercial scale deployment and the earlier stage stuff. Where is OCED in the spectrum? How are you approaching risk? Help us get an appreciation for that.
Yeah, sure. So I really see OCED as sitting in the middle of the RDD and D continuum. So you've got programs like the Loan Program Office, more on the deployment side. You've got our applied programs doing more of the R&D. And then at the demonstration level, we have OCED. And I think that we are finally kind of filling this critical innovation gap that has existed just because we haven't had enough funding to actually go to this kind of commercial scale demonstration across these different technology areas. So I would say that we're thinking a lot about risk because we do not expect every single one of these projects to be successful. In fact, if that were to be the case, then I would be faulting us because we did not take enough risk. What we're really trying to determine right now is what is our risk tolerance and how do we build our risk management profile around that. So that's something that we're trying to finalize over the next few months here. But what I would say is that we are going to try and measure risk at the portfolio level and not at the project level. We want to make sure that a failure of one project does not mean that we are not meeting our mission. In fact, we expect some failures. What we want to make sure is at the portfolio level, we are getting closer to meeting our long-term goals.
Can I jump in?
Please.
One thing I just want to add, too, is that risk is also really dependent on how you define success. And I think a really critical thing that I think is incumbent not just on the federal government, but upon civil society organizations, on academia, on industry, is to define what success is to them. And to engage with communities to help them define success. Because that's going to look really different across different types of technologies, different types of hubs, and I think will be really critical over time because that definition might change. And so I think our definition of risk has to evolve with that. One last piece to add too is that these hubs are going to define the industry for some time. And so I think really understanding that we can take that time to really assess how to make sure that we're defining those terms very carefully is important. And so just want to emphasize that too.
Yeah, that's an extremely good point. Marcus, I want to turn to you now. As we're talking about defining success, I mean, my immediate counter is wanting to ask each of you what is success for the DAC Hubs, but I'll resist that urge and try to integrate that into some of the questions I'm already going to ask you. Marcus, we mentioned earlier there's this dual challenge of innovation and scale. If you were designing the DAC Hubs, how would you walk the walk and do the talk. How would you structure these hubs to address, to intentionally accommodate scaling up quickly, but also making sure there's room to innovate at the hubs?
Yeah, great question. So when you think about innovation, you have to mentally live in the future a little bit, and so you have to try to imagine what could be and make sense of it with what you see around you. What I like what I've seen so far from what I've read from DOE, and I guess credit goes to probably people in this room that wrote that, is an acknowledgement that, look, we got a few different types of technologies that are going to develop at different scales, and let's not cut one or the other out. So there's already a recognition structurally that there's got to be some kind of balance. I think it's there are two timelines is the way it's expressed in the documentation. I think this is excellent. So already, I think we've dodged a huge sort of pothole, so to speak. Now, the exact mix of number, let's say we're conceiving of a hub. It has energy, materials, resources, probably shared offtake, some kind of shared permitting, perhaps, certainly a shared disposal site. Maybe there will be more than one direct air capture technology type at that hub, hypothetically. What's the right mix of new versus proven or let proven? I'm not exactly sure, but I think a principle we could use to try to answer that question kind of goes like this. And you asked what success looks like. Very briefly, success looks like the hubs actually up and running, serving the various communities of practice, and fully utilized, and if not embraced, not rejected by local communities, hopefully after appropriate consultation and deliberative conversation process. A few things to avoid. One, this is a bit of an oddball one, but I think about this future comment I made earlier. Technology lock-in, okay? Whenever you're trying to dramatically scale a new industry, and I know technology lock-in for DAC is not our problem today, but it might be our problem in 20 years. If one technology becomes prematurely the dominant DAC technology, in 20 years we'll be kicking ourselves because it'll make it that much more difficult to iterate. Remember, this is not a one-time thing. We want to set these things up and then run them for several generations. That probably means some technology swap outs. So thinking about that in the future when we design the hubs, I think is a great strategy. The last thing I'll say on the topic of potholes to avoid that can lead us to success, I'm going to use three examples. One of them is a dirty word. I'll just get that out of the way. Yucca Mountain. Okay? One of the lessons I took away from the Yucca Mountain episode was that picking a site based purely on the technical requirements in the end didn't work. There is another nuclear waste storage project happening in Canada that's taking the exact opposite approach. Question one is, would any town consider hosting such a site near them? Oh, if you would, then let's have a conversation about whether the engineering and business works. And they're proceeding and actually making good progress. A couple of other examples that are more pertinent to hub design. These are actually examples of, I think, the type of thing we want to develop here. One is called Porthos, P-O-R-T-H-O-S. It used to be called the CO2 Smart Grid. It's got other names. It's in the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. 45 kilometers, about 30 miles of pipe. Many users can plug into the pipeline. The disposal site is in the North Sea. The other one I want to mention is called the Alberta CO2 Trunk Line. It might be called Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. It's about 150 miles north-south in the middle of Alberta, rural country. Its purpose is to connect oil production and refining facilities, get their emissions, and then inject them for EOR. I know we're not talking about EOR here, but these are a couple of examples that exist. They are almost turned on, and we can study them and take lessons that we like. So for people that are considering putting forth ideas, study those two projects. They're actually, we might have representatives here, but they're active today. They're not that far from us. And we can use those as examples and take what we like from them.
I want to continue in this direction because I think there's so much to unpack here, and want to give Suchi and Kelly a moment maybe to respond. But something you said kind of resonated with me when you're talking about technology lock-in. The technology itself, there's more than one, as we know, and the technology itself can impact the type of business model that makes sense for operating that direct air capture unit. And so as we talk about setting up these DAC hubs for success, what, Kelly or Suchi, whoever feels inspired to answer maybe, how do we make sure that there's interoperability at a hub for these various business models that make sense for different types of DAC technologies?
Sure. Well, I think something that I think about a lot is that we first need to just radically rethink our traditional business models. CDR is unlike anything before it. It's a public good. there's really no incentive for anyone to operate or do CDR right now. That needs to change, but I think that also makes current investments in CDR and the way we think about the business model very different. And so I think that's going to evolve with the hubs, which is challenging to do. But I think two critical pieces I think will be really important is the technological diversity that's been mentioned here. I think we can't pick winners and losers, and we need to make sure that, we're evolving as the technologies evolve and making sure that we're keeping up with the science. And I think that's going to be really important for how the private sector views the space. I think the other really critical thing that I know this room has thought about a lot is carbon accounting and monitoring, reporting, and verification. The business models will depend on the success of those pieces. And so we need focused R&D, we need focused funding, and we need a lot more human capacity on those topics.
And just to further add on to what's already been said, I do believe that we are trying not to be overly prescriptive, knowing that there's several different business models out there that might work. And we do know that the technology will evolve as we move forward, and so we want to be as flexible as possible. And I think, Marcus mentioned this in his comments, but you'll see that we are approaching things differently for those that might be ready to move now, for those that need some additional time. The beauty of these hubs is the co-location of some of the infrastructure, the sequestration wells, the transportation assets, and if we can encourage intra-hub collaboration, as well as collaboration with other DOE programs, as Suchi mentioned earlier, and potentially even non-DOE programs. That's what we want to do if it gets us further to meeting our long-term goals.
Excellent. Well, in a few minutes, we're going to start asking for questions. But I want to spend these last few minutes of our sort of dedicated discussion time talking about community engagement. I'll start with you, Kelly. The Biden administration has made clear that they're prioritizing an all-of-government approach to community engagement, addressing historical inequality, and ensuring environmental justice. For the purposes of the DAC Hubs, how is DOE asking applicants and local governments to approach community engagement? And a follow-up to that, what assistance is the federal government providing to make sure that that's done thoughtfully and done right?
Let me just start off a little bit more generally, because we're not prepared to talk about what's going to be in the funding opportunity announcement that we're working on right now. But I will say, if you're looking to see how we've approached this for other large provisions, there's a battery FOA that's out there right now with $3 billion, which provides a little bit of insight as to how we're approaching things. I would say that, with the President's Executive Order 14008, as well as the Department's Equity Action Plan, we are placing a huge emphasis on energy and environmental justice and community engagement. And we really want this to be meaningful, two-way public engagement, not just submitting a request for information and going through feedback. We also want this engagement to be through the life of these projects. And it's something that we're going to hold ourselves to as the federal government, but it's something that we're also going to ask our project sponsors to do through the life of these projects. We've been working very closely with DOE's Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. We're thrilled that we now have a confirmed director for that office, Shalonda Baker, who's really been a thought leader on these issues. She is actively engaged with us, as well as the applied programs and many other offices in the department, and how we approach these provisions from the infrastructure law. And I would also say that we are being very thoughtful, not just for the DAC Hubs provision, but across all of the provisions in the infrastructure law about how we do community engagement and technical assistance. We realize if we're going to meet our Justice 40 goals of making sure that the benefits are flowing to underserved and overburdened communities, that we need to help them through this process. Working with the federal government is not always intuitive, especially to communities that are not used to this. And so we want to make sure that we're building that in up front.
Excellent. Yes, Suchi.
I think a really important thing, too, just building on Kelly's comments, is that DOE's really never done something like this before. Meaningful engagement is new and different for a federal agency to do well. And I think recognizing that and understanding that there is a role for civil society to play in also building those structures and also holding DOE accountable for them. And I think defining what meaningful engagement means is something that we still need to do. And I think that's going to be built over time as we start seeing implementation of more of these demonstrations. But I think that's also going to be defined by the people who are being engaged and whether they think what is happening is sufficient, is necessary, and actually accomplishing what they need. And so I think one of the really critical pieces that is definitely being thought about very, very critically at DOE is, how do we build this into timelines? Because this takes time. It takes resources, financial resources, human capacity resources, and we need to think about what that means when you're building huge projects. And that's going to be, I think, such a critical part of, what success will look like for them, too.
Yeah, could I just jump in and add a couple things, too? Please. I think I love that you mentioned the portfolio approach earlier and also meaningful engagement and that being a new thing. Meaningful engagement to me strikes me as one of those things we could all nod our heads and say, yeah, that's important. But it also sort of seems like I'll know it when I see it. And sort of as like an operator, I'll know it when I see it is like a disaster for me. This is a nightmare. I need a checklist, I need a playbook, I need you to tell me exactly what to do, or I need you to tell me what it isn't or something. I'm not saying I have those answers, but I think we have an opportunity to develop that. I know the Department of Energy is interested in this. I know many other parties are. There are people in the world that are expert at this. For our part in XPRIZE, what we're trying to do is get the opinions of the technology developers, like, do you know what this means? Have you thought about this? Do you have a strategy? What's difficult? What's easy about this? And hopefully that maybe is a useful input. So I think it's a really interesting challenge, but also I really believe, I think it was Noah that made this comment earlier, traditionally, we're talking about this because this kind of thing doesn't happen sufficiently, and we don't have great engagement until the point of, let's say, an acrimonious public meeting. What we're trying to do is get ahead of that. We really do have an opportunity to develop this type of technology, this industry, in a different way. I know that's a little Pollyanna, but I really think that. And it's the convergence of a couple of big themes, both justice and climate, coming together. So the opportunity is in front of us. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Can I just further add on that this community engagement and stakeholder outreach is really important, not just for the DAC Hubs, but across all of the provisions that, in particular, my office is dealing with in terms of large infrastructure projects. So one of the first divisions in my office that we staffed up is our engagement office, and we've placed such an important emphasis on it that we've said, if you are interested in what we're doing and you want to engage with us, we have a distribution list set up so that we can take those, and we will meet with you. Because we know that if we're really trying to achieve market adoption and liftoff, we need to be constantly engaging with communities to figure out what risks need to be bought down, what operational data needs to be provided to the investment community so that those follow-on dollars will be there. So, just an offer that if anyone wants to engage with our new office and provide input, we're happy to do that. So.
Okay, one more thing
yes,
as well.
Yes, please. And then we'll get your questions ready after Suchi gets the last word.
I think this is a little outside my scope of talking about DAC Hubs specifically, but in light of talking about engagement and what justice means, we have to think about how these hubs will be perceived internationally and what that will mean for the global South as we really think about what climate justice and CDR look like. And I think these DAC Hubs will not only shape how the industry functions in the United States, but how it will function globally. And that means that engagement and outreach cannot be limited to the United States. We have to start having international partners and conversations, both in places where industry might, build CDR, but also in communities that might want to, benefit from these opportunities.
That's a really important point. Thanks for bringing that up. All right, our first question.
Hi, I'm Rudra Kapila from Third Way. My question is regarding outreach to EJ communities. In the US in particular, if you're thinking about co-locating a lot of these hubs with existing infrastructure, there's already a legacy of contention in these areas. So I was curious, what particular strategies do you have dealing with legacy issues that still persist, and then how would you build hubs atop of that?
I'm happy to start off, and then others can add. We recognize that, and we've been doing focused stakeholder outreach on all of the carbon management related provisions to hear from communities. So we just did one virtual, and then we did one in Ohio, one in New Orleans, one in Salt Lake City, to really get feedback as well as to educate folks as to what is in these provisions and how we're approaching the program design. And we envision that that engagement will be something that needs to continue, especially as we get into the selection process and then eventually the kind of shovels in the ground process. It is not something that we're taking lightly. We're putting a lot of resources on it and trying to be very thoughtful in our approach. And you'll see that reflected in the future funding opportunity announcement that comes out.
Can I build on that a little bit? It's a really hard question, and I don't really think we have answers to it yet. I think it's going to be really dependent on kind of how DOE built its engagement processes, on who is potentially building there, and are we doing this in the right order? Because I think, in the past, we haven't. We've decided on sites before we've engaged with communities. And so it's going to be really dependent on making sure that these processes are not just, a box-checking exercise, but a very, focused, critical problem that we're integrating into the whole process. I think there are a lot of opportunities too for creative governance that we really haven't considered yet. Can we, create a public ownership structure with communities where they will, truly be the owner of what's happening, to control labor standards, to control, how their communities might be impacted. And that's just one example. But I think, I think it's a really key time for us to start thinking about other models that we just have never really pursued before.
If I just add one quick point too, I agree with what Suchi says, that it's a complex question and I'm not going to pretend to have the answer, but I know one thing for certain. You just cannot have an informed conversation on a topic you don't understand. If we had a community meeting tonight in this town about DAC hubs, I guarantee people would say things like, who are you? What's a DAC? And what does this have to do with anything? Direct air capture is not a well understood idea. It's a new topic. We're a relatively huge but also small group here at this room at this event. So I see any communication from any party that is effective in any way about just introducing the idea, what its strengths and weaknesses are in an honest way, is a really helpful foundation for any kind of outreach. You can't have a discussion if people don't know what you're talking about.
Excellent. Thanks, Rudra. We got our second question.
Yeah, this is Jack Andresen with Breakthrough Energy. We've talked a lot about the technology providers as well as the community engagement necessary for the success of the DAC hubs. I was wondering if you could speak to some of the other stakeholders across the sort of DAC supply chain, whether these are the storage companies, people who might be putting in transportation infrastructure, all the way to the financiers, and how you see that sort of DAC ecosystem playing out.
So I think you're going to hear in the next panel from the Loan Programs Office, who is looking at CFIA and some other related provisions. I know that we are working in clean energy demonstrations very closely with the storage program in fossil energy and carbon management. It's a lot of the same players, at least in the government, that are all kind of getting together and thinking through how we make these hubs successful, not just from the technology perspective, but all of the connective tissue that has to go through the process as well. And I would say that we've been doing a lot of engagement, not just with communities through the applicant education workshops, but also with industry and also with the investment community to figure out what risks need to be brought down to really have these projects take off. So I would say it's multiple fronts. It's not, we've been talking a lot about the technology side, but it's also with the suppliers, with the transportation, with the storage, lots of engagement on this.
Who's got a microphone? I think there's 2 mics out there right now. Sure, thank you.
I'm Jan Sherman with CarbonVert. Just a quick question on, scale. As a project developer, 1 million tons per year is barely economic. And we're really trying to drive down the cost so that we can store your CO2 when you capture it. And so when you talk about going from 100 or 1,000 tons to 1 million tons, it sounds like a lot. But, what is your level that you'd like to see by 2030 where we are actually at scale? I mean, what would make us look back and say, that really is a happy DAC day because we committed to this big volume? So what's your big volume?
I would love to know, if I can be rude and ask you the question in a different way, ma'am, what you think an economic scale might be, or maybe you can think about it if you have a number in mind. The way I think about it is, I think $1 million is a nice number that's not completely plucked out of the air, but it's a nice round number. It's a reasonable rule of thumb. I think the way to get to an appropriate number for a specific technology is, and I'm probably telling you things you know, what's the minimum size and minimum cost you can get away with to prove out the business and economics case so that you can make the maximum possible leap after. No one wants to build anything larger than is necessary. If it turns out that a DAC technology could be, you could sort of work out the kinks, so to speak, and get a clear sight to building, let's say, to 500 megatons with only a 500 ton per year unit, that would be fantastic. That's a huge scale up, but it's not impossible. You get the idea. I think the flexibility of the hubs is wise in this case. It may not be a 1 million ton facility. Perhaps that's too small, and in which case we have a flex, but if we can get away with something smaller, then maybe there's room for a couple of them. So that's a non-answer. I'd be curious to know if you have a number in mind, but that's how at least I think about what an appropriate scale on the path is. At least 3 million, maybe 10? Okay, thanks.
All right, 3 to 10. All right, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. You, then you.
Fellow at ARPA-E, and I'm really curious from the hub perspective. Obviously, that rests squarely within the Department of Energy, but how is the Department of Energy thinking about interfacing with other federal agencies that touch upon DAC? For example, EPA, of course, manages the permitting in Class 6, Class 2 wells, and we might come to a technology where those permitting requirements will have to change because the technology changes. Or IRS, of course, which manages the 45Q program.
Yeah, I'm happy to start off here. We are coordinating very closely with EPA. I would say there's at least a weekly meeting with EPA to talk about the carbon management related provisions, knowing how important they are to the overall success of those provisions. I would also say across the interagency, there is a ton of coordination going on. There is an infrastructure working group that includes members from all of the major agencies. That meets at least once a week. There's a principals meeting that is very frequent, usually once a week. There's a deputies meeting. There is a ton of interagency coordination going on, knowing that we all have to be supportive of each other to be able to implement this at the speed that we want to implement it. So a lot going on behind the scenes, making sure that it's as seamless as we can from the federal government perspective.
Can I add one more quick thing, just putting on my former FECM hat, just because the knowledge is just in there. One thing that FECM did too was create the federal CDR task force, which was created across 13 agencies for the first time to really think critically about CDR. It has more than 100 people on it, and hopefully a report will be coming out soon that gives recommendations around CDR, including on DAC. And so that, that group is just a huge resource that we've never had before for not just, DAC, but also for ocean-based carbon removal, for mineralization, for forestation, for soil carbon sequestration. And I'm incredibly excited to see how it gets utilized in the future.
Thank you for raising that. I forgot that was in the Energy Act of 2020, and I look forward to that report. I think we get one last question from Patricia. Get the last word.
Hi, thank you. My name is Patricia Loya. I'm a VP of Business Development at Carbon Capture Inc., a direct air capture company out of California. A couple things, Marcus, thank you so much for your comments. We're trying to do a project in Wyoming. We're trying to do community engagement, and we would love to see anything that looks like a checklist. I see a lot of articles, but nothing is particularly prescriptive, so we're working on our own. Anyone who wants to see my draft community engagement plan would love any feedback, because I kind of feel like I'm working blind. Second, on the DAC Hubs, we have heard from a variety of government players in states that DOE might be looking for the states to take the lead on those proposals rather than either the storage partner or the technology providers, and just would love to hear if there's any thinking that's going on related as to who will be essentially the prime on these DAC Hubs.
I would just refer you to the notice of intent. I think that it was not very prescriptive in that notice of intent, and that will probably be reflected in the funding opportunity that comes out.
Great. Well, this was an awesome panel. I really appreciate you all. I'm going to invite Zan Fishman up here to introduce the next panel. But before we do that, please give a round of applause to this amazing set of panels we had.
All right, while we're transitioning, if people want to stretch a bit, maybe people in the back want to come fill up some of these empty seats, connect some sources to some sinks.
Did a great job.
Thanks. Hey. All right. People can make your way back to your seats. We'll get the next panel seated. I know. No. All right. If the next panel can come, take your seats, please. I'm going to introduce the next panel. Please come in, fill in seats. You don't have to stand in the back. All right, anyone in the back want to fill in these seats? So, again, happy DAC Day. That last panel was amazing, just terrific. I'm so excited to introduce the next panel, because it's also going to be terrific. It's going to really focus on the future outlook, what's the business case for DAC. And to discuss that, we've pulled together people who really have a distinct understanding of what is the business case for technology in general, for entrepreneurs, and for DAC specifically. So starting closest to me, I'd like to introduce Jigar Shah, who runs the Loans Program Office at DOE. He's most recently co-founder and president at Generate Capital, where he focused on helping entrepreneurs accelerate decarbonization solutions through the use of low-cost infrastructure as a service financing. Prior to Generate Capital, Shah founded SunEdison, a company that pioneered pay-as-you-save solar financing. After SunEdison, Shah served as the founding CEO of the Carbon War Room, which you have to admit sounds awesome. A global nonprofit founded by Sir Richard Branson and Virgin Unite as a way to help entrepreneurs address climate change. Originally from Illinois, Shah holds a BS from the University of Illinois, UC, and an MBA from the University of Maryland, College Park. Next up, we have Nan Ransoff, who is the head of climate at Stripe, where her team is working to kickstart a market for permanent carbon removal. She leads Stripe Climate as well as Frontier, a new $925 million advanced market commitment to accelerate carbon removal. Prior to Stripe, Nan led product and business teams at Opower, Nest, Uber, and most recently at Neuro as head of product. She received her BA from Harvard University and her MBA from Stanford Graduate School of Business. Next up, Jay Desi, director at Breakthrough Catalyst. Jay joined Gates Ventures, Bill Gates' private office, in February 2019 to support the scale-up of the growing Breakthrough Energy team. He's helped launch new efforts and initiatives at Breakthrough Energy, including the policy and advocacy and Catalyst programs. Since 2021, Jay has led Catalyst's strategy and operations team, where he supports program strategy, project selection and funding, and operational growth. Jay works closely with Catalyst's corporate and government partners to fund the critical technologies we need to reach net zero emissions. Prior to Gates Ventures, Jay worked at Deloitte Consulting in the strategy and analytics practice, where he served clients across various agencies in the U.S. federal government, including DOE, CDC, and the Department of Defense. He focused his work on building new analytical tools to improve strategic planning and business operations for the public sector. Jay holds a BA in geosciences from Princeton University, where he studied climate science and adaptation to extreme weather events. And lastly, I'd like to introduce the moderator for this panel, former Congressman John Delaney, who's an entrepreneur, a business leader, and a public servant. He's the founder and executive chairman of Forbright Bank, a commercial bank and lender that is uniquely mission-aligned around the need to decarbonize the world. Delaney served 6 years in Congress and earned praise for his bipartisan approach to economic, trade, foreign, and environmental policy. In 2019, Delaney stepped down from Congress to run for president, and I will note is the only presidential candidate ever to discuss his plan for DAC during a presidential debate.
See where it got me.
That's because you didn't have DAC day.
Yeah.
By the age of 40, Delaney had founded and led 2 New York Stock Exchange listed companies, and at one time was the youngest ever CEO on the New York Stock Exchange. Delaney is a member of the board of directors of the Bipartisan Policy Center and a member of our DAC Advisory Council. Delaney was named Ernst & Young's Entrepreneur of the Year, received the Bank Enterprise Award from the Obama administration for lending to disadvantaged communities, and in 2017 was named one of the world's 50 greatest leaders by Fortune magazine. Delaney received his undergraduate degree from Columbia University and his law degree from Georgetown Law Center. And I had the distinct privilege of being able to serve Delaney as his chief of staff in Congress. And so to me, in addition to all the important accolades, and in addition to his important championing of DAC as a technology, he's been a true mentor and a friend. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman John Delaney.
Thank you, Zan. Thank you, Zan, for that nice introduction, and more importantly, for your friendship. Thank you. So it's great to be with everyone here today, and it's a true pleasure to have the privilege of moderating a panel with such distinguished experts in the field. It seems like 2 things have been established today at DAC Day. The first is that direct air capture technology is not only viable, because it is today, but it's also incredibly promising and important, and probably more important than ever when you think about what's happening in the energy markets right now, and the delay that may cause to the energy transition that we all want to have happen. So that's the first thing we established. And the second thing we established is that the hub programs are very exciting and marks a major step forward in terms of government policy to advance this important initiative. So what we're here to talk about is kind of the final part of the equation, which is how do these technologies scale in a commercially viable way? Because that's incredibly important, not just, not for companies to make a lot of money and entrepreneurs to build amazing businesses. That's great. That's part of who we are as a country. But it's really important because unless we can scale these things successfully from a financial perspective, they'll never live up to their potential. And then secondly, unless we can scale them, there'll never be the innovation like we've seen in so many other markets where the private sector is the ultimate kind of cost reduction machine. And they take wonderful innovation and through smart people and great leaders, they figure out how to lower costs, and make the product better, which is what we want to see happen here. So that's why it's great to have these 3 experts to talk about this topic. And we've got different perspectives. We've got Jigar, who has lots of perspectives on this topic, but right now we're going to narrow him, which is hard to do, to his role in the government, because he's a bit of a force of nature. Nan, who has this incredibly important position at one of the leading, first of all, one of the most important companies in the country, but a real forward-leaning company as it relates to this topic, and give us the perspective of how corporate America's going to think about it. And then Jay, we have a great investor who is with a great firm and will give that kind of early stage investors' perspective as to how to make this all happen. So let's get into it. So we'll start with you, Jigar. So give us your perspective of how, in your current position, which I kind of think of you in many ways as the chief lending officer of the United States of America as it relates to climate. In your current position, how do you think about your role as it relates to DAC specifically? What can you do in your position to help scale these technologies?
Yeah, no, it's a chief lending officer of the U.S. government.
I didn't mean that as a demotion. I meant it as.
No, I appreciate that. Look, I think we are fundamentally optimistic, right, about lots of technologies, right? The Department of Energy is born to be optimistic, right? We have 10,000 engineers, scientists, and experts on the platform that do nothing but figure this kind of stuff out every day. And we work with, early stage companies. I think when you get to the Loan Programs Office, our average loan size historically has been roughly $900 million. And today, right, we've got 77 active applications seeking $78 billion from the office, right? And so the size that we're at is a lot higher than I think a lot of the folks who are in the technology proving space at 10 million or 20 million or whatever it is, right? So once you get to that stage, the question becomes, what is the reasonable prospect of repayment? I'll give you just a brief example of this. On the one hand, like you've got equity who basically says, we think your future is bright, here's a bunch of money, here's a D round, here's $400 million, right? For us, we're debt. So I'll give you an example. Like on the SIFIA program, we have the ability to provide people with 35 years duration of debt, right? So pretty cool for pipelines, right? Now the question becomes, what's the revenue stream, right? The only revenue stream that we have today is a 45Q program that lasts 12 years. So at the end of 12 years, what assumption am I supposed to make for the revenue of a pipeline, right, that carries CO2? Now I could say, oh, it's EOR, right, because there's a market for EOR. But that's not necessarily politically savvy in this administration for me to say, we're going to give them all this money for enhanced oil recovery, right? And then you're like, well, what other things can we do with that, right? And then where's the LCFS program in California? Well, the LCFS program was extended out to 2030, but then there needs to be another piece of legislation that gets passed to figure out what it's going to be at 2030. And even there, you've got people who thought that the credits were going to be worth $200 a ton, and now it's trading for $90 a ton. And so what am I supposed to do in terms of, betting on American innovation? Am I supposed to bet that the technologies get so much better over time that the $90 is going to $20? Or do I bet on the regulators in California actually constricting the market to the point where the market goes back up to $200, right? And so I think a lot of the role of the Loan Programs Office is to try to mimic what John is doing over at Forbright, or what many of the banks in the country are looking to copy us when they decide to do the next set of loans, right? And so I don't know that moves us away from being fundamentally optimistic, but we are a little bit of a Debbie Downer on these things because we have to ask tough questions around how we're going to get paid back.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to lend into still an early stage market, in other words.
Yeah, particularly when there isn't a compliance part of the market, right? When it's all, extraordinary work like Nan's doing and others around, getting these advanced market commitments, that's great, right? But like, for instance, there's lots of things you could do, right? The state of California could say, if you want to pollute, now you got to pay $100 a ton to pollute, right? Or hell, you could even just say for private jets, you have to buy carbon credits from DAC to to be able to fly private, right? And so now that becomes a compliance market. I can calculate how many gallons of fuel are sold every year and how many miles people travel, and I can say, well, that's the market, right? So I do think that compliance piece is where we're all headed with all this technology demonstration, is trying to get people to figure out where the compliance market might shape up.
So that segues perfectly to Nan, because as a major and important corporation allocating capital to this topic, clearly people think one of the markets will come from corporate America making commitments to offset their footprint, both directly and one day indirectly, and they'll have to do things to do that, and one of them is obviously DAC. So how do you think about the corporate role in helping to create this market?
So at Stripe and Frontier, we are essentially trying to send a signal that there is going to at least be, in this case, $1 billion. But, Jigger, you said it really well. $1 billion does not a market make. That's a good step in the right direction, but if we're talking, 6 billion tons of removal by 2050 at $100 a ton, that's $600 billion in customer revenue every single year that we are going to need to make this market. And I think that voluntary actors like corporate actors can play a really important role in getting us to first base. But it's very hard to imagine that without this compliance market, there is going to be that $600 billion every single year. And that's, of course, global. It does not all have to come from the US. But essentially, we view our role as trying to use the time that we have right now to start building these technologies, to get a critical mass of permanent CDR solutions to the starting line so that when we do have a compliance market in place, we have stuff to buy. I mean, we are already, with Stripe Climate, we have done 3 rounds of funding so far, and we are buying tons years into the future already, which is crazy. I mean, these are really, really tiny volumes. So I think that it is, we have to leverage the time that we have now, but ultimately we got to skate to a compliance market. And so the faster we can do that, I think the faster we give investors confidence and companies confidence that there's going to be, this is an important business opportunity.
And just to level set, when you say compliance market, you mean there's actually laws that are passed that require people to do some of this stuff?
Exactly.
Okay, just want to make sure we're all following it, right? Obviously, carbon fees or other ways. There's lots of ways of getting there. And so you've made a very large commitment as a company. How did you think about the sizing of that commitment? I mean, because you're clearly trying to prime the pump.
Sure.
Right? You're trying to create a smallish market yourself to encourage people to invest, and we'll get to Jay, that's his part in a minute, to start creating these things. How did you think about your sizing and your commitment, because that might inform a little bit of how other companies are thinking about this?
So Frontier is a commitment from Stripe, as well as Alphabet and Shopify and Meta and McKinsey. So this is a collection of a number of different companies over 8 years. For Stripe Corporate, we think about this in sort of line with net zero commitments that lots of companies and governments are starting to make. Measure your emissions, do as much as you possibly can to reduce, and then deal with the rest. We have chosen to deal with the rest as not looking for a specific ton target. We are putting as much money towards solutions that we think have the potential to be really low cost and high volume in the future, even if they're expensive today. And I think that the sort of obsession with needing to remove in a specific year has forced a lot of us into throwing money towards very low quality stuff rather than looking what is most long-term catalytic. So there's a lot of different ways, I think, to come up with the amount to put towards this stuff, but I would encourage all of us to sort of think about what is the highest marginal climate value for every additional dollar that we put towards carbon removal. And Jay's done a lot of great work at Breakthrough around that topic as well.
So that's a perfect transition to Jay. So as an investor in these technologies, obviously with a double bottom line, right? You're investing in companies, but you've got a larger mission here. How do you think about making investments in the sector? What do you consider? What is your screen for, hey, in a couple of sentences, this is the kind of things I'm looking to invest in right now?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and thanks everyone for participating, and to the BPC team for having me. So, I mean, I would really just build off of what Jigger and Nan are saying, and the number one thing that we're looking for is a robust market for CO2 at a sufficient price to cover, equity investment and provide some returns, or cover the debt service, and so it's really the quality of that revenue stream. That's what's critically important to enable success of investment at the project level. And so Breakthrough Energy, we're coming at this from a couple different perspectives. We have our venture capital fund, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which invests in startups. We have about 5 direct air capture companies that are part of that portfolio. And we're seeing increasing funding going to companies at the Series A, B, and C rounds as investors really understand that direct air capture has the potential to play a critical role in the long-term decarbonization pathway for the economy. And so that's an important step. These companies need funding for R&D. Some of that's coming from the Department of Energy, but they also need their own funding to build teams to conduct that R&D, to build up the company and scale key functions. And so where my team at Breakthrough Energy Catalyst comes in is really as these companies are starting to think about how do we deploy this technology for the first time, we are trying to provide financing to help build that first-of-a-kind commercial or even pre-commercial project, which is a really critical step for these DAC companies that many of them are facing right now. And so in order to do that, it is really about the CO2 market and having some revenue stream at a sufficient price. And the challenge, as we've heard from Nan and Jigger, is that the market today does not cover that price. Right. And even if you're looking at 45Q, LCFS now at maybe below $100 a ton, there's no policy incentive that's in place, and we need more voluntary buyers who are willing to pay a higher price in order to actually be able to get project level investment into these first-of-a-kind projects, which is where Frontier and other efforts can play an important role.
So when you're looking at deals now, and you described it well, which is it sounds like the portfolio companies or the companies you're looking at, they may have some grant money, they may have some government money, they may have some early stage money for the basic science or whatever their specific model is. You come in and help them scale to that next level. When you're underwriting the revenues, absent a regulatory or compliance regime that would require payments, at this point, all you can underwrite is the fact that corporations with kind of a broad aperture thinking into the future are actually going to pay to support these technologies. Is that really what you have to underwrite now?
Yeah, that's the key lever. I mean, it's a combination of 45Q, which will provide $50 a ton, for permanent sequestration, although there's the challenge of the 12-year threshold. But a combination of 45Q plus primarily what companies either who are looking for, removals, permanent removals like Frontier, or some kind of utilization, which could be EOR, it could be, utilization for fuel or other end uses. But that really is what's available today in order to, really underwrite our investments. And there's some great work that, a lot of these direct air capture companies are doing out there in the market, really actually selling to, B2B and B2C, opportunities so that they can start generating that revenue and ultimately unlock some of this investment.
So I think we've teed up the challenges pretty well, which is a lack of a market, which is kind of obvious, which makes it hard to debt finance and lower the cost of capital for companies, right? So they're reliant upon people who are taking a much more speculative bet, and that's hard to do. You can only get so big doing that. It's hard to build big production facilities without some debt financing. And then there's a market, but it's driven by forward-thinking companies like Stripe and your partners in Frontier. So let's fast forward, and let's be optimistic. You started by saying you're an optimist, Jigger, which I think it's much better to live your life as an optimist. So let's fast forward in the future. I won't even say when. How do you see it evolving? What would a healthy market look like that would allow DAC to scale the way we think it needs to?
Yeah.
What does that market look like?
No, I think it's a good question. I think there's a few steps that we need to do to get there, right? So you start to see some differentiation now finally from the investor community between the different types of CO2 capture, right? As Nan's suggesting, there's I don't know, what is the most valuable mineral these days? Lithium keeps going up, et cetera. Maybe it's the platinum standard, the lithium standard. But so you've got this standard over here where you're actually, looking at 1,000 years of permanence, right? You've also got standards around, folks who are planting 1 trillion trees, and there are folks who are trying to put more carbon into the soil, which is a valuable thing to do regardless of, the CO2 benefits. And so I think the first thing we have to do is to make sure that there isn't a bleeding between the 3 buckets, right? That the buckets are completely different and that they're used for different purposes, right? Because otherwise, you're always saying, well, why wouldn't I want to pay $10 a ton? Why would I want to pay? I mean, even in the most optimistic scenario, I think the Secretary's got the Earthshot initiative for DAC at roughly $100 a ton by 2030, and I think we all agree that the technologies that we're looking at are capable of hitting $100. I'm not sure we all agree that it's going to happen by 2030, but we're working hard to get that done. And so I think the first thing we have to do is to figure out how to make sure that that differentiation occurs and that level, the definition of permanence occurs for the 6 gigatons a year. And I think in the US, our number is roughly 1.5 gigatons that the US has to do. And then once that occurs, then the question really becomes, what's the framework by which the compliance occurs, right? And so you could imagine some industries saying, we're willing to opt into this compliance in exchange for regulatory relief, right? We don't want all of the public shaming that's occurring all the time and all these things when everyone wants to buy petroleum in the products that we sell, right? Whether it's like, you know, household goods or clothing that people buy or whatever it is, they're just saying, stop it. If we could make it all out of like stuff we grew out of the ground, we'd do it, but we can't. We need this other thing. People want, you know, wrinkle-free clothes, so it's what it is. And so they might say, look, we just want to add $1 to every shirt that we sell so we can be done with this already and look like we've already done it. You guys, like, you know, take the gloves off and we move on, right? And so you could imagine certain frameworks and certain people opting in to this level of compliance without everyone in the entire world opting into that compliance, right? And so you could imagine it starts there, and then as the technology continues to come down and the marketplace gets larger, it becomes a safer and safer thing to do. Not unlike you know, virtual PPAs. I mean, today it's shocking to me. I mean, having been involved in the first few deals, you know, with Kaiser Permanente and others back in sort of 2010, 11, and 12, today, I mean, it's just normal. People call me up and say, oh, we just signed our first virtual power purchase agreement and we're now 100% clean energy. And you know, when you think about what that is, that's a contract for differences that a CFO has agreed to on a wholesale power market. Now it's in the money right now, but it could have been out of the money, right? And you know, Microsoft fought it for years until the new CFO came in and Brian Janis got the person to do it. And then, you know, and now it's off to the races. And so you could imagine that with this early compliance, that you could end up with a social license where CFOs and CEOs say, you know what, that trade, we're going to do that trade all day, right?
So similar question, but tying into that theme, when we think about the future, your view, because I'm sure when you all sit around the table at Frontier or get on a Zoom and talk about where this is all going, where do you see it, and how does things like that kind of voluntary trade other things for funding of this, how do you think about that?
I hope that, you know, we can get as many companies to opt into net zero commitments at the very minimum, and you know, as an important subpoint, get more clarity around what SBTI and others mean around deal with the rest. I think there's a lot of fuzziness there, and as a result, a lot of money is going into low-cost offsets right now. But I mean, I think that again, that just gets us to first base. I think that without it, I think there's a lot of different worlds that we can end up in. I think one, you know, at a very, very high level, one is a world where government is the primary procurer of carbon removal and sort of government as, you know, the sanitation model. There's another world that we could live in where, you know, the government taxes or, you know, puts the negative externality on private companies. We don't care so much which way it ends up going.
As long as the dollar
just needs, yeah, it just needs to be there.
Yeah. And so, Jay, when you underwrite this in your investments, when do you think we might see some policy changes along the lines we're talking about, either taxing it or the government creating the market, or Jigger's idea where you trade regulatory relief for voluntary contributions? So when you think about the future, similar question, but from your lens, when you think about that future market, what is your kind of base case to optimistic case when that comes and what it looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a crystal ball about what climate provisions might pass in Congress, but I'm, you know, hopeful that some kind of enhancement to 45Q may happen over, you know, if not the next several months, the next several years. But I think we need some durable revenue stream that goes beyond $50 a ton and hopefully is closer to, you know, hundreds of dollars per ton through that mechanism. I think there's other use cases. You know, Jigger mentioned the LCFS I think there's ways that California, can strengthen that policy in order to actually provide, sufficiently high prices. If it's sitting at multiple $100s a ton, which it, has been over the past several years, that can provide a meaningful revenue stream to companies. So policy absolutely needs to play, a critical role in the short, medium, and long term for any direct air capture company to be successful. And we need the durable instruments in order to get there. I do think it's important to realize that, especially when you're thinking about sort of pilots or demonstrations or first-of-a-kind projects, the policy incentive is almost certainly not going to cover all of the costs needed in order to build that project. And so regardless of policy, we're going to need people, like Nan, who are going to be providing, almost a price-insensitive, advanced market commitment or offtake agreement for a project now, because she knows that this is a really promising technology that may be able to get below $100 a ton in 10 years. And so she's willing to pay, $500 or $1,000 or $2,000 a ton right now. So it's going to have to be a mix, I think, between that underlying policy support, hopefully, which eventually is sufficient, as well as sort of a voluntary effort from companies.
So bottom line, Nan is the hero of the story.
Well,
so I've been given lots of flashcards in the back of the room, so it's time for questions. So who wants to start us off?
But just to add one thing
Sure.
to what he said, I do think it's important for everyone to note that this is how this works, right? So whether it's renewable electricity or the things, there was never a federal government mandate to do these things, right? The way that this always works here in the United States is that the federal government provides these kinds of support mechanisms, whether it's the Loan Programs Office or 45Q credits or the investment tax credit or things, and that the mandates generally come from like renewable portfolio standards, the mandate for green cement in California, New Jersey, New York, and some of these things. And so it is how we do things in this country, and I feel like there's this like disappointment in the fact that we can't get it done at the federal government level, but that's not how we do industrial policy in this country. We do it through a set of 12 to 15 states, which changes actually depending on the issue. Nuclear power, I think, will go a slightly different direction. But it will be mandated by these certain states.
Good point. Questions? Yes, sir.
Hey, Sam Eintema with the Vogel Group. With regard to the voluntary carbon offset market, and I guess this is really for Nan in particular, do you see that large companies will pay extra for a high-quality carbon offset, like a DAC offset, versus reforestation or afforestation that they could maybe get cheaper?
Right now, it's a pretty small group of companies. I think of it like a bell curve, and right now, the companies that are paying are sort of, on one end of that bell curve. In order to get the bulk of the companies in the middle to do it, we can solve that in a couple different ways. One, we can raise the floor of what's acceptable. Alternatively, we can alter the formula for net zero to make it, for example, if a company says, okay, how do I deal with the rest? I have 10 tons I need to deal with. I'm going to tax myself at $100 a ton. I'm going to put that money towards the highest value stuff I can find, but not really go for a specific ton target. That's more of an expenditure model. That's another way to solve it. I think there are ways to solve it, but the middle of the bell curve companies are looking for somebody to okay that. They're looking for somebody to say, like, yep, this is an acceptable way to deal with that, or this is okay, this is not okay. And so I think that there are ways to solve that problem, but we need to, hustle and implement those. I also think, go for it.
No, please.
I think there's a big danger in treating the carbon removal solutions we have today like a commodity. We are nowhere near a commodity. This industry barely exists. So we just need to sort of we have this little seedling that we need to nurture into a big plant or whatever the end of the metaphor is. I think we just need to be careful about treating this like a commodity too early.
I just want to add that this is very familiar, right? In 2008, Whole Foods paid $500,000 for the crappiest RECs I've ever seen in my life to call themselves 100% renewable energy. I think they bought RECs from paper and pulp mills that were basically going to burn sawdust anyway, and paid them like 0.001 cent per kilowatt hour to get these RECs, right? And then by 2010, 12, you had, Kaiser Permanente doing a virtual power purchase agreement with NextEra and Sempra and others. And it very quickly became completely unacceptable to call yourself 100% renewable with RECs, right? And so people moved to virtual power plants and additionality as your definition. And that is where we are today. I mean, certainly people still use RECs, but no one respects the people who use RECs.
Other questions?
So you think the market's going, you think that we're going to get, the market will naturally trend towards higher quality?
I think that social license is given by individual thought leaders and people. And that social license has been given and used in the renewable energy sector. But remember, the renewable energy sector still benefited from mandates. And so that doesn't say that we don't need mandates. We still need the mandates. But I'm just saying that that is the purpose of this, is once Nana's figured all this stuff out and told us which technologies are acceptable, right? Then I think we go about the business of going to Verge and some of these other conferences and saying, you guys don't get any awards unless you do it this way, because this stuff is no social license left for this stuff.
It's also not about just quality. There's a future premium on better technologies, right? Because even though it costs more, you're creating a future industry that can solve a much bigger problem than as you say, the low-hanging fruits, which may not even be high quality, but you can access right now. So the question is, who underwrites that future premium? Other questions? No other questions? Wow. So, we got one.
Sorry. Anna Fenley with the Steelworkers Union. I actually wanted to ask a question regarding this high quality, but not about the technology. Coming back to the first panel, they talked about this vision for this new industry that we could have that creates good jobs, utilizes a domestic supply chain. And so I just wondered, near term and long term, how you all think financing structures can incentivize that from the get-go for this new industry, rather than saying, we'll get to high quality economic benefits later.
You want to start?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, I think it's all about how we bake in those priorities to our investment decisions from my perspective. And it can't be just about, this technology, alone, based on the merits of the technology will help, solve climate change. It needs to be a much more holistic solution that thinks about, where can this technology get sited? What are the impacts on the community? How are we incorporating environmental justice considerations into our investment decisions? And so I think, we as funders, whether that's coming from, DOE, Breakthrough Energy, or, Frontier, I think we all need to have those priorities baked into the way we deploy capital now, because it's not only, critical to the success of individual projects, but long-term viability for the industry in general.
I want to just add that, again, we've done this before. So it's normal at the local level, not at the federal level. But that is exactly what we did for LEED green buildings, right? Like you said, in Arlington, you can build another 3 floors if you do LEED. Now, LEED was crap, and I think we understand that now. But we actually could say that you have to use green steel and green cement, and you have to do that this way, and all these other things to get the number of points to be platinum, to get another 3 stories, right? That is what has been done in the past. And the data shows that, in the totality of building a building, it's like a 3% cost increase to do that. So it's not like a 20% increase in the cost of a building to do that. So none of these ideas are things that we've, don't have analogs for.
Right, a proven approach on these problems can be applied here. I think we have a question over here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Matt Bright with Clean Air Task Force. So Jigger, you talked about these companies that, like Kaiser Permanente, essentially. All of these companies, what are there, 500 or more now that have 100%, decarbonization plans by 2050, 2060, whatever. What is the disconnect between the fact that all of us go to use these companies every day, right? But we cannot get the American people to, pass policies to essentially do these compliance markets? How do we get the companies, I guess, to sort of do a lot more? This is how the general public interfaces with climate change so we can start to get some of these larger scale policies passed that we need to as a nation to really solve climate change?
Great question, and I think it's going to be our last, if I'm right. So
I can start, but I think, you know, Jay's probably, you probably have more insight than the rest of us. But look, I think that when there is a fundamental disconnect between lawmakers about how to do these things, I think we often accuse, I don't know, the oil industry of spreading disinformation, or, you know, folks being in the pocket of whatever, or whatever it is. You know, I think it's better for us to actually not assume the worst in people, but instead assume that there's actually real disagreement on the way in which we do this, right? When you look at the conflict in Ukraine, there are a lot of people saying that the vilification of the oil and gas industry was not necessarily the right approach to making sure that the capital necessary to keep the oil and gas industry capable of avoiding, you know, $5.70 gasoline would have been helpful, right? And so you start to see a lot of this, you know, these things where people were against certain things going, well, actually, it was a good thing that we were against it, right? And I also think that there is a huge bifurcation between what the environmental groups think and what the clean tech industry thinks. And I think that there's this conflation saying, no, they both think the same thing. No, in fact, they don't. And they have different points of view. So I do think that, like, we have to be more thoughtful about how we actually get to the finish line, instead of saying, I don't understand why the federal government didn't pass the EPP, or I don't understand why they just didn't do a cap and trade bill. I don't think these people that are voting against it are anti-doing anything on climate, particularly when you've got 3 weeks in a row of 100-degree temperatures in Texas right now. And so I just think they genuinely believe that the approach that this person is recommending will lead to more unintended consequences than this approach. And I just think we have to be a little more open-minded around saying we still have to meet the absolute goals, right, which is decarbonization of electricity grid by 2035 and decarbonization of the entire economy by 2050, but be open to the fact that there are actually many paths to nirvana.
That's a great conclusion there. And I see the great senator from the great state of Louisiana has arrived, so I'd ask everyone to give a round of applause to our panel while we wrap up here.
All right, folks. Jason Grumet. I get to help kind of land this plane. I want to thank John and Jigger and Nan and Jay for a great last discussion. So my pleasure to just set the context a little bit for this last speaker. You know, there are moments in the human experience where we have inflection points. Magna Carta, Treaty of Versailles, Bretton Woods, DAC Day. Thank you. And while I am leading into the cocktail hour, like, it's actually worth every once in a while reflecting, like, you're actually all here trying to save the world. It's kind of cool, right? And it's something that, like, we work hard and the details matter, but this is truly a big idea. And it's an idea that requires hard work, which is why we are really fortunate to have, I think, truly one of the hardest working legislators in the US Congress with us today, Senator Bill Cassidy, who is, by my measure, one of the most effective legislators we have in this country. Proud to call the senator a BPC recidivist. We have had the pleasure of working with him and supporting him in everything from the current guns legislation to the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act to work on health policy and surprise medical billing and opioid legislation. It's hard to find a big deal that Senator Bill Cassidy is not close to, and that is certainly the case when it comes to energy policy. I think we all know that the senator has been one of the leading thinkers on carbon management. He worked with Senator Coons on the SCALE Act. He was one of the most passionate voices and advocates for the bipartisan infrastructure bill that Jigger is quickly spending, and in particular the DAC Hubs, which I think we all believe is really a model of the both public-private partnership, but also just the idea of scale. Fundamentally, this is a challenge of speed and scale, and it's going to require not all just the work of folks in this room, but the leadership of folks like Senator Cassidy to get it done. So my great pleasure to introduce the senator. I think then Sasha Mackler will offer a couple of closing remarks, and then we will fight the lightning and have a quick reception. But Senator.
Hey, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here. And I do think, because I think just tailing off the panel, I do think there is the opportunity to get something done on climate that is bipartisan. And it was alluded to at the end of the panel because right now there is clarity about the nexus between energy, the climate, the economy of a family and of a country, and national security. And you can speak about it to the national security hawk in a way which is totally in agreement as to when you speak to the person who is a climate hawk. And you have a discussion in which those interests converge in order to get something done. Now, I also think that the state from which I come and my background also gives me a sense of both sides of the equation. I'll first use my laugh line. Part of where I come from is as a gastroenterologist, which gives you a certain sort of scientific background. But I tell folks that my exposure to methane was far different than my consideration of it now. But it also, coming from Louisiana, I can absolutely say that when it comes to the energy portion, my state is one of the, if not the top producing states of chemicals based upon fossil fuel in the nation. We're one of the largest gas and oil states. Now, it's one thing to say that, but it is another to put it in the perspective of the economy of a family and the economy of a state. Because there are people in our state working in those industries who depend upon those good paying jobs and those good benefits to send their daughter to college, to send their son off to a better future. They see this as a form of social mobility. So aside from the fact that they're producing chemicals and products which are essential to a modern economy, they are also providing an income to their family which is essential to their livelihood. And if we ignore that, one, we do without those essential products which they produce, but we also lose the entire political support of those who know that it is unrealistic to expect to have an economy which is strong and resilient without the products that they help produce. On the other hand, my state has lost more land mass to relative rise of sea levels than any other state in the nation. We've lost as much land as the entire state of Delaware. And by the time I finish this talk, we'll lose about 10 more square yards of land from relative sea level rise. No state has been affected more, and I'm not even going into the hurricanes, which, if they've increased in severity, they've increased in severity related to the carbon in the atmosphere. So, I can speak on both sides of this in an incredibly passionate way. But we cannot speak just on either side. We have to speak in a way in which those sides intersect, in a way which addresses all. And direct air capture is part of that solution. It is part of a broader solution, but I can speak of it from a fellow who's trying to search for those broader solutions. Now, I feel as if I speak of the role of direct air capture, it is what you already know. It is going to be a benefit, but a marginal benefit. But you add up margins, and you end up with a total solution. It could be used for enhanced oil recovery, in which you could have kind of take the carbon out of the atmosphere, and you store it underground to facilitate the production of oil. Oh my gosh, we're using oil. Yes, but you're using oil while at the same time you are storing carbon. And we know part of the problem with direct air capture is having a business model which works. The technology is there, but you got to have a business model. So if you take 45QS and you have the CO2 pipelines that Chris Coons and I helped fund in the SCALE Act to help offset the cost of production, and simultaneously you're producing oil, which varies, but right now is doing very well, you suddenly created a business model which is scalable. And that's what we need to do. It cannot be dependent upon the government constantly funding. It has to have something which the private sector can then drive. Now, at some point, as we move to a net carbon neutral economy, you're just contributing to getting to that net carbon neutral economy. But at some point, as we all know, it flips and you're helping to extract excess carbon from the atmosphere, not just when you, if you will, go beyond that net carbon neutral economy. Now, we had this vision in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which I think we did a good job of creating the basis for an ecosystem that would all collaborate. I'll give you a little bit of my version. Someone spoke of nirvana. My nirvana for the state of Louisiana. I'm speaking to a bunch of experts. It's my understanding that direct air capture works best in a warm, humid environment. Louisiana raises its hand. We've got a competitive advantage when it comes to a warm, humid environment, in which you would take our natural geology, which I think Dr. Grossman at the Columbia School of Climate, whatever, said that we are the Saudi Arabia. We are the Saudi Arabia of the aquifers that will be required to store that carbon. And you, at the same time, use the SCALE Act to build pipelines to our petrochemical plants so that we take the offload from their CO2. And as a marginal cost, here's direct air capture, here's something coming from Occidental or Dow or somebody else that would go on the same pipeline, but because you have different sources, you offset you have more than one person contributing, you're offsetting the cost of the development of that, and then you store it where we have it. For my state, I would love to have those refineries powered by a small modular nuclear reactor, in which you would simultaneously providing their needs with carbon-free energy as you're sequestering the carbon which is flowing off. By the way, we also have in our nirvana for my state, blue hydrogen, in which we would be taking the natural gas that we're producing to produce that hydrogen and simultaneously storing the carbon that is associated with its production. Again, through a pipeline through which other sources are coming to help build the business case for the SCALE Act, initially funded SCALE Act pipeline complex. That would be an ecosystem. Now, as they say, the future might be now. Air Products has already announced a $4 billion project where they are going to make blue hydrogen, storing the carbon, sequestering it in the geology beneath the plant upon which they are building. BASF and Dow and others are right down the river or across the river, which would give them the access point to also store. And it's my understanding part of the business model is that this would occur. What are we missing? Wouldn't direct air capture be a little bit nice as well? And by the way, direct air capture could be something, and I'm sure you've envisioned this, but in the nirvana for my state, there would be a firm somewhere around the world that would have to capture just a little extra carbon, but it's more cost effective for them to buy a share of direct air capture. So as opposed to making an investment in their plant in which it would be a high cost for a marginal benefit, instead they would buy 10% of, so to speak, a 10% credit in that which the DAC was storing beneath the ground. There we have a business model which could work. And of course that plant could be in the Ruhr Valley because the atmosphere is being cleaned somewhere, which means it's being also cleaned in the Ruhr Valley. And that somewhere could be somewhere in central Louisiana. I thank you for this conference. Jason mentioned that which we thought was far in the future is happening now. I mentioned a scenario which is happening in my state with the Air Products $4 billion announcement. But it also takes people to still socialize and to popularize and to help others see the vision. And that's where I see the role of this conference. And by the way, I have a selfish interest in you doing well, because if Congress is able, this Congress not at all, but next Congress perhaps, to achieve a grand bargain where that family which is employed with great employment in a petrochemical plant, planning a better future for their children, is able to come at peace with those who wish to have net carbon neutrality by some date in the future, it'll be because of a discussion like this. Y'all are forwarding the discussion. Thank you for doing so, and thank you very much. I think I have 2 minutes, so I could take, I have 2 minutes. I'm getting the yank back there, so I have 2 minutes. Does anybody have a question? Because I have 2 minutes, and otherwise I'll just sip my fizzy water. Well, thank you again.
All right, well, thank you, Senator, for sharing your time with us today, and especially your vision and your leadership on these issues. We are all deeply grateful. I think that was just a fantastic conversation today. Really learned a lot, and I feel an enormous amount of energy around these issues. I'm not going to belabor the point, but I think I think we can be pretty confident DAC is a thing. We're all excited about it. And what do you think? Is DAC Day a thing? Do you want to come back again and do it next year? We're going to track this. Thanks, everybody, for your time today. I look forward to the reception. We'll be having some cocktails and drinks over on the side of the room here. Thanks.